Gonski reforms and the Gillard's version of it are a watershed. It's not the full Gonski, but I agree with Angelo, it's better than what the future otherwise held. So I'm going to talk about what I see as the big positives of this plan, but I'm also going to talk about some of the criticisms that I think are a definite disappointment and in some aspects make me very angry. But at the end of the day, I think now that the legislation is in the Parliament and will go through the Parliament, it builds a foundation for the future that we can all use whatever happens at the next election. As I say, the new school funding plan that passed the House of Representatives yesterday is a potential watershed in school funding in Australia. It breaks new ground in the history of school funding with its focus on improving equity and education. Its adoption of Gonski's equity goals and principles sets the foundation for the future. The plan provides the biggest increase in funding in living memory, certainly in the last 40 years. It proposes a $14.5 billion increase in school funding over the 6 years from 2013-14 to 2018-19. It is expected that the federal government will contribute $9.8 billion, that is nearly $10 billion of this increase, with the states and territories contributing the remainder. Every state will benefit, some more than others. New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland and Tasmania will get increases of the order of $4,000 to $5,000 per student over the 6 years, and the Northern Territory an increase of $7,500 per student. Western Australia, however, does get very little, only about $800 per student over 6 years. Now, the small increase in WA is difficult to understand, and I am at a loss to explain it without any further details of the model. And the reason it puzzles me is that the ACT, which spends slightly more per student than WA, they're the two highest expenditure jurisdictions in the country. The ACT will get over $1,600 per student, even though, as I say, its average expenditure per student is actually even higher than WA. And it has a much lower proportion of low-income students and Indigenous students, and it has no remote area students. And on this basis, you would think the Barnett government has a good case for a better deal, and it's hard to understand why it is not willing to negotiate on behalf of its disadvantaged students. It is in fact abandoning the state's low-income Indigenous and remote area students, and you can only think there is other motivation, that it's not actually, it has got a strong case, but it's not actually trying to negotiate that case. The ACT did negotiate a case, and they got an extra $90 million. As Angelo says, the new funding model will provide a huge benefit to government schools Australia-wide. They get $12.1 billion compared to $1.4 billion for Catholic schools and $1 billion to independent schools. Funding of this order could make a huge difference to reducing the gap in school achievement between rich and poor throughout the country, which at age 15 amounts to 2 to 3 years of learning. Low achievement is strongly associated with low socio-economic status students and Indigenous students. About 75% of low-income students and 85% of Indigenous students are enrolled in government schools. Government schools, therefore, have far more to do with their resources than private schools. Yet government schools have much fewer resources than independent schools and only similar resources to Catholic schools. The school sector with the greatest resources has the lowest proportion of disadvantaged students. Total funding per student in independent schools, according to the latest figures, is 40% higher than in government schools, $16,300 compared to $11,600 in government schools as an average across Australia. However, independent schools only enrol 10% of low-income students and 5% of Indigenous students. These figures show how skewed and inequitable the current funding system is. When the sector that looks after the least proportion of disadvantaged students gets the largest amount of resources, not just from government but from private sources too. It is this inequity that the Gonski model seeks to redress, and this is the fundamental importance of the Gonski model. The Gillard Plan, because it adopts the basic framework of the Gonski model, it represents a marked change in the direction of education policy funding, education funding in Australia. Instead of a primary focus on funding for school choice, as in the Howard government's current model, the SES funding model, the Gillard Plan gives priority to reducing the effects of inequity and disadvantage. The Gonski model, because of its focus on equity, has put the defenders of privilege in education on the defensive. Only the most extreme advocates of privilege can deny that improving equity in education outcomes is a central priority in education policy today. And when they do this, they are seen for what they are: a rich elite removed from the realities of the daily lives of the most disadvantaged families and students across the country, and lacking in any sense of common decency and humanity. Another watershed in the Gillard Plan is it breaks the link between government funding for private schools and average government school costs. This is a highly significant change. The link is a major source of inequity in school funding. Every time state governments increase funding for disadvantaged students in government schools, a portion of it flows through to private schools, including the most privileged and richest private schools. The link to government school costs has allowed private schools to double dip on government funding. Not only do private schools get direct grants from federal and state governments, but they get this indirect funding increase via increased funding to government schools. Private schools with none or very few disadvantaged students receive windfall gains from any increases in funding for disadvantaged students in government schools. Under the new model, the Geelong Grammars of the world and the Sydney Grammars of the world will no longer be able to double dip on the taxpayer. However, having adopted the Gonski framework and representing a fundamental change in the way schools are funded, the Prime Minister's model is not the full Gonski. Indeed, it's a long way from the full Gonski. At this stage, we only have details of the federal government's plan, or its funding program as announced in the budget papers earlier in the month. And the budget papers show that most of the $9.8 billion increase coming from the federal government is backloaded on the last 2 years of the transition period. And this is beyond the traditional four-year forward estimates of budget papers. Only $2.8 billion will be provided in the next 4 years, leaving $7 billion in the last 2 years of the transition period. And I take Angelo's point that even this small increase in the first 4 years represents a big change from what would otherwise happen. But the problem is that there are at least going to be 2 more federal elections before the bulk of this funding is ever delivered. Consequently, there's no guarantee that we're going to ever get that extra $7 billion, particularly under an out-of-bed government. And that is another reason why this should have been dusted and done last year. The other issue about the increase over the next 4 years, that is the $2.8 billion, is it's going to be financed largely by the termination of existing programs. 5 national partnerships programs are going to be terminated in the next 4 years. The funding allowed for in the forward estimates of those programs is $2.3 billion. So you increase the 2.8 billion promised under the Gillard funding plan is that the new money amounts to 0.5 of a billion. That averages out at about 125 million a year. Unfortunately, the Gillard government is playing smoke and mirrors with Gonski. The other uncertainty is whether the full Gonski increase, as distinct from the funding promised by the Gillard government over the next 6 years, will ever be delivered. The Gonski recommendation was for an additional $6.5 billion in 2013-14 dollars. You index that forward to 2018-19, and the final figure that should go into our schools as additional funding every year is $8 billion. I don't think that's in the government's ballpark. It's not planning that. We are not getting the full Gonski. The second major concern that I have about the Gillard plan is that the money that's actually going to be allocated to disadvantaged students is relatively small. And in the case of low SES students, it's to be spread over a much larger number of students than proposed by the Gonski report. The increase for low SES students could be too little to make a significant difference to the gap between rich and poor, although all schools will welcome the increase for the extra things they'll be able to do. According to the information released by the federal government, 83% of the total increase in funding will go to schools whose funding is currently below the national resource standard, and 17% will be allocated to the various disadvantaged funding loadings. Low SES students, for example, will get 7%. Students with disabilities will get 5%. This means that disadvantaged students are going to get about 2.5 billion of that full Gillard plan of 9.8. And about $1 billion of that will go to low SES students. This is actually less than the $3 billion provided under the current low SES Communities National Partnership Program over 7 years. Of course, the caveat to that is that many disadvantaged schools will gain additional funding because they too are currently below the national resource standard. However, it's not possible to work out the allocations at this stage because many medium and high SES schools are also resourced below the national standard. So we've yet to see how that funding is going to be allocated. There are two significant differences between the Gonski model and the Gillard model as regards funding low SES students. First, the Gillard model provides slightly more generous funding loadings for low SES students. Its range of loadings begins at 15% of the resource standard compared to 10% in the Gonski model. Second, while the Gonski report recommended funding loading for every student in the lowest 25% of SES backgrounds, the Gillard plan spreads the funding much more broadly. It provides a loading for every student in the bottom 50% of SES backgrounds, with students in the lowest quartile receiving bigger loadings. This means that more than 95% of schools in the country will receive low SES funding. The government's case for funding loadings for the second lowest quartile is that a significant group of these students achieve much lower outcomes than students on average SES background. This is true. The 2009 PISA results show that while 24% of 15-year-old students in the lowest SES quartile were below the international reading benchmark, 15% of students in the second lowest quartile were also below the benchmark. And there are similar figures in mathematics and science. So there is a strong case for additional funding for students in the second lowest quartile as well. But the issue is whether the actual loadings that are provided are going to be large enough to make a significant difference. And I think the evidence suggests not. Overseas research studies show that the additional expenditure required for low-income students to achieve at adequate standards is up to double or more the cost of educating an average student. This implies loadings of one or more, that is, double the funding. Under the Gillard model, the maximum funding loading for low SES students is 0.5, and this applies only for schools that have over 75% of their enrolments from the lowest SES quartile. Low SES secondary school students in these most highly disadvantaged schools will only receive an extra $6,000 per student to compare to just over $12,000 per student if the loading was 1 instead of 0.5. And even this maximum loading will apply only to a tiny proportion of low SES students. According to the My School website, only 331 schools in the country, 265 of them government schools, would have qualified for this loading in 2012. Total enrolment in these schools was just under 30,000, of which about 25,000 can be assumed to be in the lowest SES quartile. In 2012, there were approximately 600,000 students around the country in the lowest SES quartile. Therefore, only about 4% of those students are going to qualify for the maximum low SES loading under the Gillard model, a loading which, as I say, is well below the loading suggested by the research evidence. A third issue with the Gillard plan is that it looks like it's going to be even more riven by special deals than the Howard government's SES model. Just as the integrity of the SES model was undermined by special deals with Catholic and independent school organisations, new special deals are being negotiated that will undermine the integrity and coherence of the Gonski model. The Prime Minister has already broken with the principles of the Gonski model by promising Cardinal Pell that Catholic schools will retain their current share of federal funding. This, in effect, this does introduce a new link between government school funding and Catholic school funding. Federal funding for government schools will apparently not be permitted to outstrip funding for Catholic schools, even though government schools enrol much higher proportions of disadvantaged students than Catholic schools. Catholic schools, for example, enrol 16% of low-income students and 9% of Indigenous students, compared to 75 and 85% in government schools. This special deal will allow Catholic schools to double dip on federal funding. In addition to their direct funding under the new model, they will receive additional funding to compensate them for any loss of enrolment share to government schools or other private schools. For example, if the number of disadvantaged students in government schools increase, this will draw increased federal funding for those schools and decrease the share of Catholic school funding in total federal funding. Instead, Catholic schools will receive additional funding to maintain their current share, even though their enrolments of disadvantaged students are unchanged, increased by less than in government schools, or even decline. Similarly, an increase in enrolments in other private schools will draw an increased percentage of federal funding, for which Catholic schools will compensate. This new special deal adds to the one that was incorporated into the Gonski model at the behest of the federal government. The focus on improving equity in education in the Gonski model was diluted by a new no-losers guarantee for medium to high SES private schools. This is the government's promise that no school will lose $1 of funding under the new model. This means that medium to high SES schools that have large privately sourced funding will continue to receive government funding and be able to maintain a large resource advantage over low SES government and private schools. Gillard's new no-losers guarantee also protects the special deals done by the Howard government to maintain overfunding of some 40% of private schools. These are the so-called funding maintained schools that were allowed to keep their funding they would otherwise have lost if the SES model had been strictly applied. The overfunding amounted to $615 million in 2010, according to the Gonski report. All of this funding goes to well-off private schools. None of it goes to low SES private schools. These schools get to keep their overfunding under the Gillard plan, although it will be indexed at slightly less than for other schools. A further issue with the Gillard plan is that it's accompanied by a plan for school improvement, which has lots of good things in it, lots of really sensible things. But part of it involves extending the market-based features of education. In particular, national testing and reporting on science will be introduced. State education authorities are encouraged to adopt performance pay for teachers and principals, and increased school autonomy is a condition of future funding. The extension of national testing to science and more reporting of school results on My School and presumably in league tables around the country will harm education further. I don't need to spell this out to you in terms of the effects of narrowing the curriculum and teaching. There is little evidence that performance pay or greater school autonomy increase student achievement. At best, the evidence is mixed, but generally the weight of evidence from research studies is that they have little effect on student results. School autonomy also tends to reduce collaboration between schools and increase social segregation and inequity in education. Unfortunately, I think the Gillard government has made an unholy mess of Gonski. Not only has it delayed implementation for far too long and made it hostage to the election campaign, but has not adopted the full Gonski. The funding increase committed over the next 4 years is only a small percentage of the full Gonski and is largely financed by recycled funds. Its funding for disadvantaged students is far too low and too widely dispersed to make the big difference we need. And the integrity and coherence of the framework suggested by Gonski has been destroyed by more special deals with private schools, and we've yet to see what the special deal is for independent schools. However, having the principles of Gonski enshrined in legislation is a huge step forward. And the more states that sign up, the greater its significance. It would indeed be a major achievement. It would provide the foundation for school funding in the future and offer the opportunity and hope for a full Gonski. It will indeed be a watershed in the history of school funding in Australia. Having the Gonski principles enshrined in legislation will also make it harder for a coalition government to revert to the unfair and incoherent SES model. This is why it is so important to continue the pressure on governments to sign up. This is why Abbott and Pyne are leaving no stone unturned to stop coalition governments signing up, and why they are so angry with Barry O'Farrell and Adrian Piccoli in New South Wales. The other Liberal state premiers are playing cheap politics, turning their backs on increased funding for disadvantaged schools and students for party political gain. Some 36% of all Victorian and Queensland students are from low-income families. But the Napthine and Newman governments are prepared to put their education and their future at risk by refusing to sign up to the new model. It is unconscionable. We cannot expect anything from a coalition government. The coalition has refused to commit to the Gonski model. Tony Abbott says that the current system is not broken and not in need of fundamental change, despite the criticisms of it in the Gonski report. The coalition has no commitment to reducing disadvantage in education. According to Tony Abbott, it is private schools that are the victims of an injustice because they get less public funding than government schools. The coalition is ruthless in its protection of privilege in education. As Abbott has said, supporting the funding of independent and Catholic schools is in our DNA. Whatever happens at the next election, Gonski has given us something to fight for in the longer term. The Gonski model, as I say, is the foundation to build the future. It is vital to meeting the biggest challenge facing Australian education, reducing the large achievement gap between rich and poor, and this has to remain our fundamental priority in education policy. In conclusion, I would like to pay tribute to the campaign waged by the Australian Education Union in support of the Gonski model. It has been a tremendous effort in the most extenuating and difficult political climate. And on behalf of Save Our Schools, and I'm sure other supporters of public education everywhere, I would particularly like to congratulate the efforts of Angelo and his colleagues and express our heartfelt gratitude for your commitment and tenacity in fighting for a better deal for government schools and disadvantaged students.